What is the government's role according to the Bible?
There's a little quote from Romans chapter 13 where he specifically talks about our relationship with the government and what God expects the government to do. And he says, it's a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. And here's the key part. For it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So my takeaway from that is that from God's perspective, the central role of government is to basically punish evil. That's God's expectations. Now, in history and life, there is a problem. And the problem is, number one, what happens if the government becomes corrupt? Problem number two, what happens?
That would never happen, Kirk. It would never happen.
What happens if the population, becomes corrupt? When I say corrupt, I'm talking about in relation to what's evil and what's good. So as a civilization becomes increasingly corrupt, God says it tends to say that what is evil is actually good and what is good is actually evil. And we're seeing that in today's civilization, our society. So traditional Judeo-Christian morality, for example, is some aspects now are seen by our culture as evil. Other aspects that once were evil under Judeo-Christian moral principles are now regarded as a right granted by our government and our judiciary. So that's where things get complicated, because then the government's no longer enforcing or punishing, and I quote here, bringing wrath on the one who practices evil. They end up actually bringing wrath on the one who practices good. But there's another complication, and that's what if the population itself is not interested in Judeo-Christian moral principles or what the government says. And that complicates things further. Now, up until a couple of years ago, I used to think that basically the government follows the population, at least in a democracy. So the population decides, what do we like? And, this one here matches most closely to what we want. Therefore, we'll vote this government in, and the government, therefore, feels obligated to continue to do polls to see what the population wants so that they can continue offering them that. And so if the population goes corrupt, if they deviate from God's moral principles, then the government tends to go that road. And if they try to legislate, let's say, traditional morality, because traditional morality actually, and that's a vague term, but we're going to talk about traditional morality in many different cultures, not just Judeo-Christian cultures, is not that far off. There's quite a bit of overlap, a huge overlap with what we would call Judeo-Christian morality. So traditional morality is a larger umbrella term, but if the government insists on legislating traditional morality and the population doesn't like it, they get turfed. They'll turf the government. But that's what I used to think, and that's partly true still, I believe. But what I saw in the last 2 years is that, and with the government and the media, is that there's a much higher percentage of people in our society who can be influenced by the government and the media, so that if they had no position, or even if they were slightly against something, if the government and the media begins to promote a message, I was surprised. I was really actually shocked that how many people are actually influenced by that. They don't necessarily think through things critically. It's just this daily onslaught of propaganda, government positions, media, and so forth that just seem to change the minds of the general population. I suppose, like I read about it back in the Cold War, how they would arrest certain people, and part of the brainwashing that would go on was to subject the prisoners every day to education times, where they would
re-education camps.
Re-educate people by constantly repeating things. And, I knew that this seemed to work, but I thought it would only work under duress, under like being in jail and being subject to this day after day, food deprivation. But no, it actually works for the general population when they're not actually all that deprived. So here's the conundrum we find ourselves in. The government does seem, from what we read here, to have a moral responsibility, or a God responsibility to legislate according to what's right and wrong and punish those people who do wrong. And if they do that, it will influence a substantial chunk of the population. That's on the one side. On the other side, if the population in general is really going down a different road, they resent the government. They'll not elect them next time, and they'll just go their own route anyways. In other words, we see two things happening here. There's intrinsic motivation and there's extrinsic motivation. The government can provide extrinsic pressure, even coercion. But if you really want to see change, it really ought to happen from the inside, intrinsically. And if the government coerces it's not a good society to live in when a government increases the number of laws, increases the penalties, maybe even brings in emergency act or whatever to enforce its will on the people or its version of events on the people. It's not the greatest situation, but if the general population intrinsically wants to do things the right way, that's a whole better program to run on. And when we look at Jesus Christ and what he modeled when he was here, there were plenty of things to protest. For example, Roman colonialism. They were under the heel of the Roman Empire. Human rights abuses like whippings and floggings to the point where people would die, crucifixions. And it wasn't just on Easter. Jesus and the two thieves weren't the only people crucified. This was common practice in the Roman world for crucifixion. And they would hang them up along the road, and they shield your children's eyes as you walk by. So there's human rights abuses, there's slavery. There was plenty of things, plenty of issues here. So what did Jesus do? The leaders wanted, or the general population wanted him to make the government, wanted him to take over basically, but it wasn't his time yet to do that. Instead, everything he focused on had to do with intrinsic change, the relationship of the person with God. And when that happens, then something else spreads throughout society like yeast throughout dough. And you actually begin to see a more powerful, positive change rather than trying to make the government, enforce extrinsic motivation to do what's right.